So next topic, because
Mhm. Sure.
I've had this question for a while, and I know I probably have connections and incarnations in there. So kind of jumping over to the Atlanteans and the people that escaped that. I was always kind of wondering if you could bring one of their essentially engineers or people who actually move those giant blocks that you kind of see them their mega structures that they use. Basically, I wanted an Atlantean that actually was able to.
Participated like in the construction of it.
Yeah, yeah. I was kind of always wondering how they actually were able to move those giant blocks that are like 100 tons without like needing to bring an actual machine in or what we visibly think of, and how they actually cut the blocks as well as move them and everything.
Okay, let me see. So this will probably be a collective that I tap into rather than an individual.
That's completely fine.
So um, this whole reality, this is what they want me to share. This whole reality exists because of intention, like pure intention and faith, um, and the ability to manifest. So because of faith, but but there's such a masculinity around this whole reality. Like the energy here is masculine, but not in a controlling kind of way. Um, so it's literally by energy, the power of intent, but they're showing also like very basic resources like water, and how water and the what would you say here, like the density of water and how it can, it offsets the density of solid things. um, Water was used, but as well as like pure intent. And I want to say manpower, but it's funny because it's not like physical manpower. It's the power of intent, but and also like movement through manifestation. Like, you know how, like what they're showing me is, how they're, I don't know, I'm sure there's a group, like a name for this group of people, but there are women like in India who can seemingly like manifest gemstones in their mouth. Like they manifest things right in front of you out of thin air.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they're showing the same phenomena happening with the whole build of this whole place, the whole reality is, if you bring enough together, enough intent, like the quality of energy builds because of the strength in the numbers and the intent. Um, it's like if you have one person trying to move an object with their mind, it can be done. It just takes extreme focus. But if you have 100 people trying to move the same object with their mind at the same time, you're going to make a much bigger impact. So what they're showing is it's a combination of using very basic resources like water and the power of intent and energy. And I want to say, like, to things can be made invisible, to offset, how do I say this? Like to opposite. So like if in a quantum mechanic kind of way, if I knew the density of an object, I just have to opposite the density of that object in order to move it. So I feel like the Atlanteans had a very clear understanding of quantum mechanics in that way. Do you see what I mean? Like, because if you, what they're saying is, if you understand the makeup of something or anything, the energetic makeup of it, one, you understand how and why it's manifesting the way that it does, but two, you understand the totality of it, which means you know how and where you can impact it. If you need to move something, if you need to change the shape or form of something, you can. But most people sort of walk and function with an underlying belief of separateness. So it's me and the object instead of I am the object too. And so it seems as though the Atlanteans had that understanding so they could change and impact and construct and destruct whatever they wanted, seemingly like that.
I'm gonna have to process that because that's a lot.
Mhm.
I want to sure go. Um,
It is a lot for
yeah.
sure. It is a lot. There's definitely a lot of energy around water, though, for sure.
So would they get in resonance with the water and actually use the water to cut or like
Yeah.
uh connect within the object itself to actually like because there's water in everything.
Yeah. Right.
So essentially they would connect with the water and actually use the water to okay, I know how this works. I actually kind of do that already and like one fun skill that I have is I can connect to the water and generally speaking anything, and
Hmm.
I can imprint emotions onto like a room. I've actually
Hmm.
been able to create essentially time fields in a room, like different
Oh, that's awesome.
like I can make time go slower, faster, or just kind of stand still to where like like you don't feel like any time at all has passed.
That's so cool.
It's a
That's
fun
super
skill to have.
interesting. And
It's a fun skill to have.
water is the most ancient resource,
Yeah.
but also the most conscious. Water has consciousness, and um, it's never going away. It changes forms all the time, of course, but it's also the most powerful resource. So there's a lot of emphasis on water and shaping things with water, shaping and reshaping and designing, they're saying, with water. And sort of, again, they keep showing like the construct and the deconstruct, like the building up and the tearing down, and the maneuvering too. So the Atlanteans, this is something I've never read on, I've heard about what it is, don't have the first idea of what it's perceived to be. But the Atlanteans seem to be extremely in touch with intuition.
Mhm.
Um, almost makes me think of, the movie Avatar, like the Avatar, like they function through love and compassion and intuition, not so much the mind space. Atlanteans seem like through and through that way, like magical.
They're developing technologies right now, and they have been. I've been sitting on this for 7 years without talking about it. And here's the basic idea. Resonance frequencies. Everything vibrates. If we had an electric razor, plugged it in, turned it on, set it on this table, it's going to move around, isn't it? That's the beginning of the concept because it's vibrate. Everything vibrates at a frequency, and if you know that frequency, you can control things. And I think that's the basic idea of what we're looking at here.
So somehow, through this technology, they're able to move stones or cut stones or all the above?
All the above. And it's all based upon the ancient numbers.
It's true that 10,000 years ago, the Great Pyramid in Giza was used to harness free energy, and every household in Egypt had electricity.
No, not every household in Egypt had electricity. The Great Pyramid 10,500 years ago can be used to harness energy and convert it into electrical current, but that was usually mostly used by the priesthood and the pharaohs and the kings. It wasn't distributed in the way that you think. In Atlantean times, more like 20,000 years ago, the idea was that they knew how to create crystals to vibrate in certain ways, that there would be sympathetic vibrations in the crystals distributed throughout the community, and therefore, in that sense, they were able to have light and other forms of energy in the different households. But that's not exactly electricity as you understand it, although electric current to some degree, or electrons, as an electron field more specifically, was involved in that. It was an attempt to recreate that to some degree with the Giza pyramid, but it was relatively limited because the idea initially of some of that knowledge had been lost, and the ability to recreate some of those crystals was also lost. So it was a lower form of that idea that produced an electron field to some degree, but its use was limited and not capable of being spread very far.
I see. And how close was Nikola Tesla to rediscovering free energy?
He absolutely discovered it. It's just that the information was suppressed.
And which present-day countries would be most
Well, now that we're back, for those of us who are open, we're back to another time and another reality. So tell us some stories about what we would consider magic now, but was a part of that reality, potentially how the big stones were moved by people matching the vibration of the stones and singing their vibration up to make them lighter, solving one of these riddles of how they moved these big blocks, or any stories that come to mind that of this time that you remember back in Chem 12,000 years ago.
Well, we were told since we were being born the stories of how we are drops of water from the universe. So from the very beginning, we were connected to the nature, making us become aware that we are everything that is around us. And they used to tell the stories that the universe dropped tears of joy during the creation, and that drops created an ocean of mind, and these water drops sometimes freeze and creates matter, and that matter is us being born into this reality, and inside ignites the fire that with the water and the fire expands the voice, which is the air. So they say that we have the water inside in the shape of matter, of a stone, with the light of the fire inside that pushes the voice of the air, and which is the truth. So we are drops of the mind made into matter. So because of this story, we all grew up knowing that we are nature, that we are everything, and that you can talk to the mountains and everything. So they told us a story that the universe dropped these first 9 drops of tears that we call the vowels, and each one of the tears vibrated in one way, which altogether sounded like and that's why we called it the Om. But it's like actually where a e i u o u, and all these sounds were the first drops to the mind, and they divided into the water, the earth, the fire, and the air. And these 4 had each one of them a purpose in the universe, which was first expression. We have to express, it was the water. We have to experiment, the earth. We have to integrate the fire and transcend the air. So each one of these processes, for each one of these drops, had 4 drops more that took matter, and we call them the consonants, and we're 36. So 9 times 4, 36. So they call the 36 patterns and sounds that could shape the reality. So we were told about how by singing, by the words, the transcendence of ourselves, we could manifest new realities and create from the ocean of mind. And that allows us to talk to the plants and know which medicine was the right one. That allows us to talk to the snakes to tell us how to heal. That allows us to talk to the rocks and move them. and we knew that we were the snake, the rock, the tree. So we were just communicating with another part of ourselves that is another drop in the ocean of the mind. And this way of thinking things made a context, a very natural context, in which we were able to build the geometry, the reality that we were seeing. That's why the pyramids are not to rise you up to the skies. The pyramids are actually octahedrons, which is the very tiniest reality that you see when you go deep into the divine. So in order for the world to become a portal of the divine, we needed to sing to create with the matter that we had, the octahedrons, to connect with the divine. So all our culture was about to communicate with the world, and we call them the Arsayan. I named my foundation because of that. Arsayan means those who talk to the world. And we were taught to how to communicate with everything, with the world. And it was part of our process of learning. We had 3 main schools. Not all of us would go through the 3, mainly the first one. The first school was Emenian. The Emenian were the ones that taught you about the letters, about this story that I just said, how the unity spread into all these realities and to understand them and how we are part of it. Then the Arsayan would teach you how to communicate with each one of those parts. And then the Idyllian were the last ones where you become them. When you become and you are able to handle the weather, the storms, to move the rocks, and to build something like a pyramid, for example. So these 3 main schools, I went through the 3 of them, and
you were a woman.
I was a woman,
yeah,
related to the school of water. That's why all my connection is with the element of water. And so I went to that school, but I was obligated to go to that school, not because of choice, because I wanted to, but because I had the resonance with the element. So the priests and priestesses would choose between the children who was able to go to each one of the schools, and you would spend a long time doing the preparations for that. So it was a tough path that we had to do along the Nile to prepare ourselves to leave behind what we believe we are. So we had to break through each one of our layers of the ego until we become the element. And that was what we today remember as the gods and the goddesses of the ancient time. They were just people that represented a concept or an element of the universe. So we had to become that, and we were called divines or gods or something like this, but everyone knew that we were people. But we were inspiration for others to become that. So representatives of the divine on earth. We were not treated like gods. We were treated like guides. So we were forbid to be taken as gods, because otherwise you didn't understand what was all this about. So we were just there as a living presence to encode an information that others needed as a guidance to become something different. And that's why we were forced in such a way to be married to one another, no one else from outside. So we had to get...
So water people had to marry water
No, water had to be with the earth, the fire with the air, and you cannot mix it. So you were kind of forced to do it. So you have to deal with it. And So, for example, the ones on Earth were the ones taught how to move the stones. The ones in water were taught how to break them, for example. But so how to pour the water, how to make it vibrate, but we were not the ones levitating the rocks.
So that's how you actually created the clean breaks in the stones, because there's
Yeah.
a lot of debate about how did they chisel it so
Yeah.
precisely.
Mhm.
And really what you're saying is that the water
and sound.
the water priests and the sound, using the sound of the water, changing the vibration of the water,
Mhm.
and maybe with the help of the earth priests and priestesses,
Yes. We were all working together.
working together could actually cleave the stones.
Yes.
And then the earth priests and priestesses could then sing the stones lighter and then have them guided in place.
Yeah. For us today, when we look backwards, it's like a movie. But you should not go so far, and you can go to the tribes in the Amazon to see how people are called. You are the jaguar. You are the, the elements of the master of this. You are the eagle or the white eagle. You have these names in the Americans' traditions. You still have this thing of becoming an element, becoming an animal,
being
to awaken this potential. So you can do that, but when the whole civilization allows you to do it, it's so powerful that can move mountains. Actually, you can create an earthquake, you can create a storm, you can pour the fields. So that's why that civilization was so balanced with nature. Usually when people think about Atlantean civilization, think about technology. But actually for us, we were taught since we were very young, that we are the technology, that our bodies are the real technology. And everything that we do around is just to improve the signal of our technology. And we don't need anything from the outside. That's why when you go to the archaeologist, you can find these huge stones and creations, but you can't find anything else.
Yeah, because you were still riding around on mules.
Yeah, we were living in the forest. We were living in the nature. We had houses, we had things, but they were made with such natural things that they disappeared. So we didn't need much. So it is not like we expect for a civilization to be today, that needed a lot of things in order to say we have technology. We were the technology. Our bodies were the technology. So we were able to communicate by singing, by thinking, by feeling. Hugging a tree, we could send a message to other village. We were able to become nature, to become everything. And that's why also they use animal paintings or stuff like this. And that's why some people believe that the priests or priestesses used to have heads of birds, but actually we were representing the nature, what was really there.
What did they look like when they were in their physical form? Because I know they were really tall. Like
They're tall and they're broader. Like their shoulders are a bit broader than normal humans. But they have I keep seeing reference to Egyptian, hints of Egyptian features, bigger, I guess you would say almond shaped eyes, but exaggerated, a little more wide set, a little bit bigger.
Well, that's where a lot of the survivors of Atlantis went after the deluge happened. So that's kind of because they're the ones who actually built the Pyramid of Giza and the really advanced pyramids that are in Egypt.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
like you could, since you're connected to them, you can like you can see that probably for yourself. But like
That's
that's
so interesting. I didn't know, but I mean, there's definitely some strong ties to Egypt and hints of those features. So the like I want to say like the DNA or the energy is definitely crossing between those cultures or realities or whatever. But their their shoulders, the interesting thing is like their features, they look, excuse me, very similar to us, but a bit bigger, a bit taller. And the one thing feature that I'm seeing that they have in common is their shoulders for men and women are broader than their hips, like noticeably broader than their hips. So yeah, as you go up in their stature, their shoulders just seem, and they have like their forehead to their nose, like it's flat, it's flatter. It's not like, big pronounced noses or anything. It's just flatter. Whereas like, I guess other cultures, we have more pronounced nose bridges or whatever, but very masculine features. Even the women, but they're tall. I mean, you don't see any that are overweight. They're all very lean. They're tall, lean, and strong.
what did
But
their
very,
hair look like as far as like
okay.
curly,
But they're
straight?
very centered, very direct, like very dominant sort of presence. I see a lot of dark hair, and I see it's like I can't tell if this is a braid or a dread, but it's like a lot of shoulder length, but it like a lot of the hair goes straight back and it's just on top of the shoulders. But it like just the pieces up front are either braided or dreadlocked or something, like to be a little more ornamental. And I think that has something to do with status. Like the way the hair is worn determines, like, I want to say like tribe leader or something like that, or how it's braided or something. But everything from different headpieces to things in the hair also denote status. So, and like authority. So it's really fascinating. Men and women, I feel like, have longer hair. I mean, it's just very primal, like there's not a lot of like extra stuff like clothing or jewelry worn. It's worn with intention, to convey a status or a place of authority or something like that.
Today, specifically New England and these legends of the tall ones, because many Native American legends talk about these giants, and for a long time they were thought just to be legends, but actually we've got 1,500 accounts from newspapers, old diaries, scholarly journals, and even the Smithsonian itself saying that they were giant skeletons between 7 and even 18 feet tall. And then we're going to look at, first let's have a look around England and Europe. We're going to focus on England briefly for a moment, especially Wiltshire, this particular area. But this is a map put together by our colleague called Cecilia Hall, and she's been researching with us, and she helps plot all the finds we make and puts them onto Google Earth so we have a good database to work from. And these are the ones so far that we've found in Europe. And you can see there's quite a majority of them in England. So we'll have a look at some of those first. I think the most famous image of a giant actually to do with Stonehenge is this one. This is actually the earliest depiction of Stonehenge ever made. And it was done in the 1200s or the 1100s. It was based on the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, The History of the Kings of Britain, but was actually painted by a poet called Wace. And it depicts what it's believed for a long time. This was believed to be Merlin, but now we think this is Merlin, and he's getting the giants to move the stones for him. And this kind of dates back at least that far ago, and there's a whole story associated with this, which is particularly interesting, and it's described in the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, where supposedly the stones came over from Ireland, from a place called Killaroos, and they were transported magically over by Merlin himself with the help of giants. But before that, the stones actually came from North Africa and made their way over to Ireland, where they constructed this temple. And then later, Merlin and the giants brought them over to Stonehenge. So there's very strange stories associated with this. Where that story came from, we don't know, but it's probably based on very ancient history and very ancient legends. So is there any truth in that? Is there any giants found in this particular area around Stonehenge? This is an old photograph I found of one of them. But there's actually, we do have, there's a couple of accounts. Well, we've got about 6 accounts very close to, there's one, a 7-foot skeleton was discovered there. And this was this was in the book, The Historical Topographical and Descriptive View of the County of Northumberland, published in 1825, where they describe a 7-foot skeleton. John Aubrey even stated that a huge skull was on display in a local church for over 100 years, and it's recently disappeared. And this is Maria Wheatley filled me in on this, and it was between 8 and 9 foot tall if the height was based on the skull size.
So let us go back in time, approximately 12,800 of your years ago, or what you typically refer to as 10,800 BC. This was approaching the end of the days of the Atlantis civilization that had existed for many thousands of years. Began when there was the migration of those indigenous peoples in what you call your North and South America, the migration across the continents from west to east, eventually creating the colony of Atlantis in the islands that you now recognize to some degree as the Bahamas and Cuba. Although remember that in those days there was great ice shelves coming down from the north, covering a great portion of North America, and the oceans, having that much water locked into ice, were much lower at the time, somewhere between 250 to 300 feet lower. Thus, revealing, if you even look at your ocean maps today, the outline of the islands as they used to be. The Bahamas now are simply the remnants of what used to be the main island, along with Cuba, of the Atlantean civilization, though they did, of course, spread into North, Central, and South America, and even cross the oceans into what you know as Europe in the Mediterranean and Northern and Western Africa. But even though their so-called empire was vast, the main islands were off the coast now of what you call your North and Central and South America. And many people on your planet at this time, because much of the history was lost, and because most of what you still remember of the idea of Atlantis came through ancient stories from Egypt that were passed along to individuals in Greece and then shared with your modern individuals, you tend to imagine, because these stories came from Greece, that Atlantis had something similar to Grecian architecture. It did not. The closest representation that you have of Atlantean architecture is Aztecan architecture. Large stone blocks, the kind of pyramids that you find in Central and South America. These are the appearances of the kind of structures you would have seen in Atlantean times. And the Aztec architecture that remains is the closest remnant to the idea of Atlantean architecture that still exists on your planet. Now, it did change a little bit when they went over into the idea of the Mediterranean, but it didn't become Grecian architecture. The closest representation is that which you call the Minoan architectures, specifically the Temple of Knossos on the island of Crete. You will see there an ancient Atlantean colony in that temple, which is known as the Labyrinth Temple and the legend of the Minotaur, for the Atlanteans were bull worshippers. So the idea is that they adopted some of the Grecian architecture, but still retained something quite different. For if you look at the architecture of the Temple of Knossos, you will find that the pillars and the structures there are not what you would find in the area you know to be Greece. They are painted differently, they are shaped differently. And it represents more the idea of the Atlantean idea of decoration, being that the pillars are red and black and the stones are white. And if you look at the remnants of the labyrinth that exists in the Temple of Knossos on the island of Crete, you will see that it was actually an initiation labyrinth which came from the culture of Atlantis. For when you follow the traces that remain of the labyrinth that are dug into the ground and lined with stone, you will find at the end of every single turn a large crystal buried in the rocks of the labyrinth. So that at each station there was an opportunity to meditate on those crystals, to resonate with those crystals, and work your way through the labyrinth in the sense of a particular ritual that will allow you at the end to allow your mind to open up to new understandings, new information, new initiations of the cosmos. This came from ancient Atlantean times. Now, in the days before the destruction, which actually covered a very large span of time, for there was a, shall we say, very large master comet that came into your solar system and took up an orbit, an eccentric orbit, that crossed the path of Earth's orbit twice every year. And for a period of time, rained down upon the Earth, as the comet broke up, various remnants that would impact your Earth and cause great destruction. These cometary fragments, twice a year, bombarded the North American and Atlantic region for a period of over 2 decades. Every year, twice a year. The obliteration was almost complete of anything that existed in those areas over that span of time, which is one of the reasons why you very, very, very much don't see almost anything left of whatever was in those areas. Imagine being bombarded for over 20 years by cometary impacts in your city. There wouldn't be much left. But it started relatively small, and mostly bombarded the ice shelves and the eastern seaboard of the Americas, many chunks falling into the Atlantic Ocean, causing tsunamis. But there was at one point a greater chunk that came through the atmosphere, the primary body of the comet, that finally penetrated the atmosphere and struck in the Atlantic Ocean, gouging out a crater in the ocean floor, and caused massive tsunamis in all directions, radiating out from the Atlantic, tsunamis at least 300 feet high. This is the obliteration, the final obliteration of the idea of Atlantis, cultures on the eastern seaboards of North, Central, and South America, tsunamis that struck the western seaboards of Europe and Africa and into the Mediterranean. And this is the beginning of your legendary flood of Noah. The idea also is that in those ancient times before the final destruction, since there were many cometary impacts and since they could observe the master comet arcing through the sky before it ever hit, they understood by plotting its trajectory, and especially after some of the fragments began to impact the Earth, that their time was running out. Many of them fled into other areas to preserve their culture, their knowledge, their civilization, going into South America, going into some parts of Central America, going into parts of Africa, parts of Europe, and all the way into the beginnings of the culture that became Egypt, bringing their knowledge, bringing their technology, their architecture into the understanding of what it took to build the great pyramids in Egypt. But before that time, again, in observing this master comet, which still to this day provides what you call meteor showers at certain times of the year, including the time that is coming up now. That was the time of the destruction of Atlantis in its final days. You still find what you call the toroid meteor showers are the remnants of that comet still to this day shooting through your skies. But now, simply the remains are very small and burn up in your atmosphere rather quickly, providing you with a spectacular show, but still acting as a reminder of those days, back when the sign of a comet in the sky and the memory, the civilization's collective consciousness memory of that comet is one of the reasons why comets developed the reputations that they did of being bad omens of destruction. It comes specifically from that comet that destroyed Atlantis. Now, also at that time, the idea, even though the concept of dragons is also something else, also interdimensional beings that present themselves to you in your reality in a certain way that you have called a dragon form. Comets also in ancient times were referred to as dragons, for they crossed the sky with their glorious burning tails, and again were akin to the idea of the interdimensional dragons in how they appeared against the stars. So you can see that many different kinds of ideas, many different legends about comets and other things developed from this one experience that began an age upon your Earth that your scientists recognize and have labeled the Younger Dryas period. This shifted your climate radically at that time. And the cometary impacts that impacted the thick ice shelves on the North American continents caused much flooding, much runoff. And that spilled into the oceans over time, raising the ocean levels, so that today you find they are 250 to 300 feet higher than they were at that time, submerging most of the Atlantean islands that existed in the Atlantic Ocean. And again, one of the main reasons why you find it so challenging to find any remnants of that civilization today, although some things do still exist in those areas that you have yet to discover. But let us look at those last days and bring into your imagination the idea of a thriving civilization of beauty, of great pyramidal structures, of great paved streets, of stone and temples, painted red, white, black, and sometimes sheathed in gold and silver, and the combination alloy that was known as orichalcum, which contained also copper and mixes of gold and silver in various proportions. And the idea of the beautiful, shining crystals that gave light and power to the ancient capital cities of the ancient Atlantean Empire, and that also could be used in understanding their vibration for long-distance communication between the main empire islands and the outposts that existed around the planet. The idea then is to imagine, in those days, the beautiful brown-skinned people walking on those streets and floating above those streets in lighter-than-air balloons, and understanding the idea of the stars and having astronomy and a great understanding of mathematics and a deep understanding of the earth and nature and their part in it, that over time, over eons, became split into those that retained the ancient ways of connection to the earth and those that began to slide down into the idea of fear-based beliefs and the corruption of the concept of the illusion of power. Your psychic, Edgar Cayce, referred to these as the children of light and the children of darkness. For there was this split in Atlantis, as such a split is now even beginning to accelerate in your time. For the idea itself of the Americas is a recounting and a recycling of the idea of Atlantean times, and an opportunity for you to lift yourselves up into a different future and a different path and a different outcome than what it is that they themselves experienced. For they knew they had reached the end of their cycle. And so many of those that understood their connection to the earth, their connection to the stars, began to migrate away from the Atlantean capitals into various parts of the world that they knew would be safe, where they could rebuild, where they could preserve their knowledge in ancient structures such as some of the ancient pyramids, preserve their libraries in Alexandria and in Giza under the Sphinx, and in certain areas of Yucatan and South America and Peru, where some of those libraries still exist today and have yet to be discovered. That would reveal much about the Atlantean times. But thinking back again to those days and knowing that these beings were recognizing that they were coming to the end of a cycle and leaving in great ships, there were those simply that did not believe and did not take heed and perished in the destruction. For some of them, while they were corrupt, some of them simply could not bear to leave their homeland and knew through their learning and their knowledge, through their understanding of their connection to nature, that there would be an opportunity once again in what you call their future, in what you call your present, for them to live out through the idea of reincarnational experiences, those cycles once again, and to look to the light and bring the light with them that would allow for a different, a more positive, a more constructive, a more peaceful, beautiful, and artistically creative outcome, so that in a sense, even though the island itself has sunk, Atlantis may arise again in a new form, in the same basic continent that they had crossed, migrated across to create the colony of Atlantis, the empire of Atlantis, so that it may rise again in the Americas one day. Listen to the knowledge that was preserved of the indigenous tribes of South, Central, and North America, for they contain the information and the knowledge of the rising of Atlantis once more. Allow yourselves to imagine yourselves again connected to those times and walking those streets as the indigenous population that knew the stars and knew the earth in deep ways that you have yet yourselves to experience again, except for perhaps a few of those indigenous tribes that remain on your planet that have kept to the old ways, the ancient ways of knowledge, and know that the cycle has now begun anew, and that you are in those times, not only the end times, but the beginning times, that allow you once again to experience the glory, the beauty, and the grace, gratitude, and appreciation that was paramount in the highest days of the Atlantean civilization. And they did interact with many forms of natural life, in particular, communicating with the dolphins and the whales, many of which were allowed into the temples through great channels, through great ideas of canals, which allowed them to swim right into the center of the pools in many of the temples in Atlantis, so that they could commune together and build the idea of a society of land and sea, and had much knowledge of the idea of the herbs of nature and the foods of nature that would promote healing, and the vibrations that would promote the idea of stability and healing and beauty and health and wealth in the connection to nature that they experienced in those days. Allow yourselves to feel within your own being once again that connection to nature. Let at first, before it appears within the actual physical reality, let at first that feeling, that knowledge, that rising of Atlantis to begin within you, within your spirit and within your soul. and allow it to penetrate deeply within your hearts. And feel the drum beat in your heart that was utilized in Atlantis as a teaching mechanism. For when the drums of Atlantis matched the heartbeat, then they could, through induction, slow down the drum beats and allow your hearts to slow down into a meditative, hypnotic state in which all lessons were given and all lessons were retained, because they were allowed to go into the state in which all information that was given was absorbed easily and effortlessly and retained throughout their lifetimes. The drums of Atlantis are the key to the states of being that will allow Atlantis to rise once again from your hearts, from your souls, from your spirits, and from your bodies, so that it may once again one day begin to appear upon the land that you know as the Americas.
So there's a place in Ohio called Mound Park or Mound State Park or whatever. I'm pretty sure that was actually built by the survivors of Atlantis, if that's
the Indian mounds. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's where like the parts of the earth came up in shapes of animals.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's like 45 minutes away. It's where my mom lives.
Well,
and I have never visited. Isn't that crazy?
Well, I just watched a documentary talking about like the different mounds that they had in that area, like because I'm pretty sure that's where a lot of the survivors that went to North America ended up at.
That's wild. I need to go visit. I've never been there. There's one like a snake. There's one like
the serpent mound. The serpent mound.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like the kind of giveaway to me that was like Atlantean kind of stuff is the way it's aligned to True North and a lot of other stuff. Since they're here, could you like ask them if that was part of their like the people after or their survivors or people after their civilization crashed?
If those mounds in Ohio were?
Yeah.
Okay. They're showing yes, like in a really strong way. It's a way for them to how do I see this? It's communication. Like it's a way to leave a trace, so to speak. Like it's a way to communicate and I keep seeing like it's a feeling of like letting you know where I was, letting you know where we were. It's almost, you know what else they're showing me, just to kind of give like an example, like how we find crop circles and there's no explanation. It's communication happening. And I don't want to say marking territory in the sense of like mine, not yours, but showing like landmarks to show like to communicate here. You know what I mean? Like here, this is where. So, but each one has its meaning. Like I don't even know how many there are, but they all have different messages as far as what.
There used to be a bunch more, but they at the turn of the century when they were putting like highways and stuff through Ohio, they took out a bunch of them. Like they completely obliterated them.
Oh, that's terrible.
There's actually complete pictures of them like hauling away giant like these large mounds that were actually.
What's really intriguing is a lot of the ancient sites all across England have the name giants associated with them. The first name of Stonehenge was the Giants' Dance. It wasn't called Stonehenge till a much, much later date. We have giants' graves all over the place. You know, the list goes on, and they're usually associated with earthworks and megalithic sites. The Cern Giant is obviously another one that Peter's researched and written about. But we get the same kind of thing happening in North America. There's always to do with megaliths, it's to do with ancient mounds, and it's to do with these ancient traditions, and it's all over North America. These are some examples from the whole area. I mean, from every state we have reports from in America, all 54 states. And it's just amazing. Even on Hawaii, we even find them going into Mexico, into Canada. We've got examples in South America, the Caribbean islands, Easter Island even, and all the way around the world, in fact, when you start looking. This just shows you some of the accounts we've uncovered. And you can see where they congregate in this area here. This is basically what's called the Ohio Valley or the Ohio River Valley. and this is like the real hub. But a surprising amount stretch up into New England, which I've been researching for many years just because of the megalithic sites up there. All the way down the east coast into Florida, along the Gulf Coast, all down here into Sonora in Mexico. We have many examples. Baja California, southern and northern California, literally everywhere you can think of. There seems to be a bit of a gap here for some reason. We're not sure why that is, but the much earlier races of giants seem to congregate around this area here, especially going on to the Channel Islands, which we have human occupation going back at least 30,000 years, and evidence of giants at least 4,000 years old. And we find the same thing around Nevada and Arizona. We have mummified remains found near Humboldt Lake, and also Spirit Cave Man, which are dated to over 9,000 years ago. And these are mummified giants, often with double rows of teeth and red or ginger hair, which is very, very strange when you start looking in to the whole prehistory of what was going on in North America. The fact that there's this many that we've uncovered just ourselves is probably just the icing on the cake. And the fact that it's been covered up so carefully and so meticulously by the Smithsonian Institution, it really does raise a lot of uncomfortable questions when we try and talk to them about this. I mean, I've actually been to the Smithsonian and tried to ask them about it, and they're like, huh? Giants? You mad? And yet we know that they received at least 500 different bones and skeletons just through the accounts that we've uncovered. So this is the area we're going to look at first. This is the whole New England area. We have all the different states mentioned here, but we also have in white all the native tribes who once existed in the area. This is actually from about the early 1800s, and these are the tribes that were still existing then. And there was many, giants still alive in the early 1900s and late 1800s. The Osage tribe, or the Osage tribe, were very powerful, very powerfully built. They existed in certain parts of New England and New York State. And even some of the presidents witnessed them and wrote about them. We have a whole chapter in the book about presidents and giants. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, actually dug up a giant when he was building a fort in Virginia, and actually found a 7 or 8 foot skeleton. And in one of President Abraham Lincoln's speeches, he describes the giants of Niagara that have now been lost. And so even the presidents were aware of what was going on here. And they were kind of linked kind of with the Smithsonian. And then that's when it all went quiet and it was all dismissed as a great big hoax. So this is a close-up of some of the areas we're going to look at. Particularly here, we're going to start in Vermont. Now we're going to look at a few megalithic sites that compel me. This is up at a place called Calendar 1. And this is like a megalithic series of chambers and stones, standing stones, and a whole complex, and it's all astronomically aligned. This is one of the classic chambers you find all over New England. There's probably been about 200 or 250 of these that have been recorded all over New England. They're like sort of fogus like you find down in Cornwall, but also they're very similar to many of the chambers you find all over England and Britain and Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland, Scotland, everywhere. And in France you find examples like this, and they have this often sort of roughly east-facing entrance, but also they have very large megalithic lintels over the top, and they're often astronomically aligned to the equinoxes and the solstices. This was put together in a book called Manitou by Byron Dixon James Mayville. This is one of the authors here. And they worked out a whole megalithic astronomical complex up in the hills of Vermont. And this is the research they put together using Alexander Thom, the brilliant English archaeoastronomer, as their basis. And they were able to work out that many of the chambers are aligned specifically, and they were recording the whole year, and also the 18.6 year Metonic moon cycle. This is Calendar 2. This is nearby in Vermont. This is a particularly large and interesting chamber. It's got huge roof slabs. You can't really see them here. But this one aligns to the winter solstice sunrise, much like Newgrange does in Ireland. This is an old photo of from the authors when they and it just shows you the sheer magnitude, these multi-ton blocks that make up the ceiling here. There's also in Vermont, we found evidence of giants in southern Vermont at a place called Bellows Falls near Rockingham. there's these very unusual, you can still go, we actually, me and Jim Vieira, my co-author, we actually went down here and visited these and photographed them, but I can't find the photos for some reason. But these are all still carved on the rocks, and these were right next to an area where a giant skeleton was uncovered in the early 1800s. And this one here is particularly, these are all fairly interesting haircuts and antennas and things like that. But this one grabbed our attention because it looks like it's got extra teeth there, or something going on with its teeth, which we think may be the earliest representation of double rows of teeth we've actually found.
So what I have surmised from looking at maps and then going back over the random information I've gotten over the years, and as I put this whole videos together, this area right in here was where the main chain of islands for Atlantis actually was, and what we see as the Caribbean right now actually was the remnants of that civilization. So when a majority of the survivors went from this area, they came up into this area up here into Ohio, where the earth and mountains are, as well as where you find a lot of giant skeletons all over the place. So, and this will kind of, when I put together another video on specifically Lemuria, because you can even see in the Gulf right here, this was much lower at the end of the last ice age during the Younger Dryas. So a good majority of what you see out here is a lot of the shells were actually exposed, and this is where that's where a lot of the actual mounds that were further up were actually, a lot of that ground was actually further in. Just going off of the work from Carlson, he kind of, a lot of the ground that was in this area got washed away, and that's where you see a lot of this kind of stuff. So as the Atlanteans retreated back and went up into here, they also came over to the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and a good portion of the Mediterranean, when this was lower. And then they also came up here to the United Kingdom. So a good portion of the stories that are actually in our history about giants, it was actually the survivors of Atlantis. Which also, this was actually above land, which you had Doggerland. So this would have been all exposed but you can, looking at the actual the shelves, how much lower the land actually was. It actually brought, you can actually see in the actual maps that what's going on here, as far as like it was a much larger amount of land actually available. So, and that's why you have all these stories about giants in this area. The Recot structure was not actually part of Atlantis, but it was a colony. So the area right over here that everyone's like, the Recot structure was Atlantis. No. Atlantis itself, the main body of it, was actually over here. A really good friend of mine is actually a glacial scientist, and what she told me and what I've surmised from my own research is there's a process, because you had the giant ice sheet over here. When all that melted at the end of at the Younger Dryas, all the weight of the ice sheet when it melted, it lowered back down the seafloor, which is what you see right here, and when it raised up the ocean, it also lowered down the seafloor, which buried a good portion of, and it's why this area is pretty much empty these days. They found pyramids right here, as well as in a few other places under the ocean that were 12,800 years ago were above water. And they've also found structures on these islands as well as these islands that are about 250 feet below the sea level now. But all this would have been much more exposed 10,000, 12,000 years ago when the Ice Age ended, or right before the Ice Age ended. And then getting to over here, what we know as New Zealand, which this came through a different channel. If you know who Ryoka Ryo is, the first civilization that happened after humans were created was called the Lemurians, or Mu, which was their name. And they were actually over here on New Zealand, and a lot of their structures were just really basic things, much more connected to nature. And a lot of this was above water. Well, all this was above water, but that's actually where they were located. Like I said, this will come out in a later actual video. But when their continent sank, or their island sank, they actually came over here. So a good portion of the stories about giants, the ones that came from over in this area that they found, were actually more Atlanteans that had survived and moved into North America. Whereas over here, the reason why there was a gap in between the two of giant skeletons found were because over here, this is where actually the Lemurians went. And that's where they found giant skeletons around Mount Shasta and other places on the west coast. So that's actually the distinction between the two different skeletons, or the two different types of giants that have been around. Other places that giants have been found were actually obviously in the Gulf of on Baja, but another place that Lemurians went when they actually when their island sank was actually to South America. So a good portion of the actual stories about giants in South America actually started with Lemurians, and when Atlanteans came over and colonized part of South America themselves, that's actually where a good portion of their... So basically what you see in North and South America and Central America is actually just remnants of the civilizations of Lemuria, or Mu, and Atlantis. So most of the actual giant structures like pyramids were actually inherited from those civilizations. And if you really get down to it, that actually makes a lot more sense, that coming across here for the land bridge for traveling over 2 miles of ice, which really doesn't make much sense if you really get down to it. If they came from this area and they were able to travel across the oceans to this area, because there's a lot of myths of humans actually arising from the ocean. Like you find those things all over the world. And if they came from civilizations that had their continents or their islands sank under the ocean, that would actually make a lot more sense as to why those myths actually appeared. So this is going to be my first video in a series of very kind of condensing the story that I found. And I just want to share the way that at least I'm viewing it. And I wanted to give a much more clear way of, okay, this is a much more holistic way of thinking, instead of being like, oh, we came from Africa only. Well, we came from all over the place. And but this is my conclusion as to why there's giant skeletons and why all these megalithic structures actually exist all over the place, which is the survivors of Atlantis were able to levitate the stones as well as connect to nature, and they were able to actually bring their technology and their understanding, which the technology is in you. You are the technology. you are to be in resonance with things and connection, because everything is resonance, realistically speaking. And if you're able to connect to that sort of resonance within yourself, you can affect the world around you. And I think that's actually kind of the important part, is to understand that your physical world, the technology that we see around us, is actually just an extension of who we are as beings. So I just wanted to share this. It's been on my mind for quite a while now, and this is the first thing I want to share in a series of amazing videos. Have a great day.